Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the video. Today I want to show you how to master your music with only the stock plugins in Logic. Let's get started. So the very first step to mastering is to go through your track, listen through, make sure you understand where the song goes, where the loud parts and the quiet parts are, and then along with that, also making sure that you've faded in and faded out your track how you want. So when you export, it's going to be the exact length and the exact amount of time in and time out that you want. So I just did a really small fade in here, so there's no hard pops or clicks or anything. And then at the end, I did about a 3-second fade out. And fade. 3 seconds. Just helps ease the song out, and that way there's no pops and clicks if the audio file suddenly stops or anything. After that, I'm going to start with Subtractive EQ, and I like to use the regular channel EQ for this. So the purpose of Subtractive EQ is to remove any bad frequencies as early as possible in the mastering process. Because as we go, we're going to start adding other plugins, which will possibly add sound, add gain. So we want to make sure all the bad stuff is out first. So the very first thing I like to do is a high pass filter, and this is going to cut lows. You need to be really careful with this because there are lows right down here. You're kicking your bass, and you don't want to pull those out. The idea is just pulling out some super sub lows that aren't going to be played through most systems. I'm talking like below 30 hertz. And this will just help save energy and headroom for the more important frequencies higher up in the spectrum. I also like to go through kind of the low mids and the mids and make sure there's nothing harsh. To do that, I'll get a pretty narrow cue and I'll sweep around and find anything that is kind of building up or doesn't sound that good. I'm doing really small cuts here because imagine what's being done on the track here is being done to every individual channel in the mix. So you need to be really careful because small moves go a long way here. So I'm going to roll with what I have here for now. I might come back and make some other tweaks later, but that's the first step, Subtractive EQ. The next step is my first compressor. For the first one, I like the vintage VCA. This is kind of the SSL bus compressor feel, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, it's a really good kind of glue the mix together compressor. So I'm going to start with a 4-to-1. The idea here is a little bit faster of a compressor that's going to tame some of the peaks immediately. This will help us later when we're doing some slower, more gentle compression and also limiting. We won't have as many peaks jumping out. So my threshold's at -12, ratio 4-to-1, makeup gain's around 2 dB because that's the maximum amount of gain reduction I want to do. And then I have a fast attack at 10 milliseconds and a fast release at 51. All right, the next step is the Multiband Compressor. So if you've never seen one of these before, it's essentially 4 different compressors, right? So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 right here. Each one has regular settings that you'd see on all compressors. It's important to note there's also an expander down here, these 3. You can ignore that. We're not going to use those at all. So we're just going to focus on these top 5 boxes here. This essentially divides the frequency spectrum into multiple compressors. This first one here, you can solo it up in here. It's just the low end, below 160 hertz. And you can move these around kind of to where you'd want to. I'm going to keep this a little lower, probably around 110. And so the idea here is you're taming peaks and places that the audio gets a little too loud in multiple spots in the spectrum. I always like to start on the low end and work my way up. So you can grab this threshold right here, which is the same as this box, and start to pull it down till you get a little bit of gain reduction. And so what I like to do with this low band is help balance the kick and the bass. And so if there's too much kick, you're going to want a fast attack and fast release, so it'll dip that kick without hurting your bass too much. But if your bass is too loud, you're going to want a slower attack, slower release, so that your kick can push through before it's compressed. In this instance, we definitely need more bass and less kick, in my opinion. So have a faster attack at 2 milliseconds, a fast release. And then I'll add just about a dB back in makeup gain. You can play with the ratio if you want, but I prefer lower ratios here, so I'm not doing too much. You can really mess up your master if you go too hard on this thing. I've done it before and it doesn't sound nice, so be very careful. I'm going to increase my attack on this one because I want some of those transients from the drums and synths to cut through. So I'll give them maybe like a 16. That way they have a chance to get through a little bit. A little bit of makeup gain. All right, next one. This range here, I like to dial it in so it's the range that is really sensitive to the human ear. Kind of where it's at is where I'd like, but this is where, you know, if a mix is going to hurt people's ears, it's going to happen in this frequency range. This one's also nice because if you set it right and your vocals are a little hotter than they should be, it'll attenuate your vocals as needed. So you could see while the vocalist was singing here, we were having some peaks attenuated, and then once it switched to instrumental, that kind of went away. And then we'll check this high end. Just getting some peaks. We don't want to go too crazy with it. Okay, so here is without it. Next thing is additive EQ. So at this point, we're starting to shift a little more out of the cleaning and a little more into the creative and making it sound better side of things. So additive EQ is where you're adding in frequencies that help the mix, that complement it and make it sound better. So today I'm going to use the vintage EQ, but you can use whichever one you like out of the vintage EQ collection. I like the vintage EQ collection because it adds a little bit of color and saturation and character to the mix, where the Logic channel EQ is very, very neutral, very flat. So I'm going to start with just this low boost and high boost right here, and then I'll get into this other stuff if I feel it needs it. That's nice. I love the low boost on this. This increases the width. So we're gonna go fairly wide with this, and I'll start at 8K and see what that sounds like. Maybe a little higher than 8K. I'm gonna try 10K. So I'm adding a lot of gain here, so I might want to tweak the volume here. I'll bring it down like a dB. I know that's not quite the amount I'm adding, but I'll start with that. The important thing is that the perceived difference in volume should be equal. So I'm going to keep pulling this down until I can engage and disengage it, and it feels like the same volume. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. If you want more sauce, more analog, you can increase this drive here, and you can even change the output model to one of the other EQs. But I'm going to roll with the Silky, which is the Tube Pultec version. And I'm going to roll with that for now. You can push this. It's really hard to hear. You could just push it all the way up if you want. Nobody's going to be mad about it. Overall, that feels a lot warmer, a lot smoother, more analog. It feels better to me. So the next thing I want to address is imaging. And if you're not familiar with imaging, that's essentially how left or right your mix feels, kind of how wide it feels versus how mono it feels. So to start, I'll just simulate what this is so you can get a feel for it. I like to use the Direction Mixer plugin for this. And we're looking at this spread right here. Direction is essentially just like a pan knob. I don't really mess with that for mastering because we need it right in the middle, kind of full. So here's a spread at 1.0, which is kind of original how it came in. And then if I pull it down to 0, you'll hear it go all the way narrow. Right, so it's right in the middle now. And then we could pull it super wide, and there's basically no middle, it's all sides. You may need headphones to hear this. If you're not in headphones, definitely put headphones on. And the way I like to use this is actually with this crossover. So if you hit split right here, you'll get a crossover frequency. And so this basically says below 150 hertz is going to respond to this direction low, spread low, and then above 150 hertz is going to be this one up here. So this is nice because I like to make my low end a lot more mono than my top end. And that helps, number one, most systems you're going to play back on, if they have a sub, it's going to be one sub, most likely. So having that clear, clean stereo image in mono lower in your mix is really going to help it translate to multiple systems. But it also, having something more mono helps make your your width above feel wider. So I'm going to make this spread low kind of go a little lower. Okay, so I made the lows mono, and next I'm going to just make the highs like a little bit wider. You know, it actually feels too narrow on the lows, so I'm going to open that back up a little bit. Cool, I'm gonna roll with that. Use this direction mixer to taste. There's also a stereo spread, which basically pushes certain frequencies to one side. I don't really like it. It's weird to me, but if you're into it, mess with it, go through some presets, see if that works for you. The next step in the process for me is when I like to use an exciter and add any saturation, any last minute coloring. It's important to add a little bit of color to the mix and a little bit of excitement, but you don't want to overdo it because you're going to lose the original feel of the mix. So next, I've been playing around with this Fat Effects plugin recently. I've set my default here to nothing on. I turned off all the little modules and I turned off the limiter here. And the things to look for are mostly this distortion section. So I'm going to turn this on and you can change these to whatever you want. Let's put some diode, some soft saturation. They have an exciter here too. So I definitely like this soft saturation. I'll put a little bit of that. Yeah. I like that. That sounds good to my ear. Play around. There's a lot of options here. Some of them get a little crazy, but I really like the soft saturation and the exciter. Okay. Next step is going to be a final compressor. So the idea of this compressor is a more slow, smooth compressor. It's going to help level out any remaining peaks that might get in the way of limiting and try to deliver a smoother sound to the final limiter. So I like the vintage Opto for this. I love putting the LA2A at the end of my mastering chain right before the limiter. Let's do a 4:1 here. I don't know what the LA2A ratio is. It's the secret magic ratio, but we're definitely going to go slower. Let's try 30 milliseconds, like 100 milliseconds on the release. All right, 4:1 was too much. I'm going to do 2:1. Just a tiny little bit of compression to give it another layer of smoothing out before we get to the limiter. And last but not least is the limiter. So I'm going to go down to Logic, Dynamics, and Limiter. You definitely want true peak detection on because it's a little more accurate on your ceiling. Gain is going to either push or attenuate the level of your entire track. So we're going to use this in combination with this output level here. This output level is the absolute ceiling that it'll let the audio go to. So if you have it at, -10, it's not going to let the music get louder than -10. But my favorite move with this is doing -0.1. And then release and look ahead. Mess with them to taste. I usually leave look ahead right where it is, and then the release will help you kind of dial in the sound of the limiter. We're going to start pushing this gain up until we get some peak reduction, and we're going to try to get this track as loud as we can without it sounding distorted or hearing too much of the limiting. So I'm going to start pushing this gain up here until we get some peak reduction and we get the track a little bit louder. Watch your volumes here because it is going to increase the volume a little bit. And then what you can do after your limiter that's pretty important is go to metering and then pull up this loudness meter. This will help you measure your LUFS, which is kind of a measurement of the overall loudness of your track. So I'm going to hit play. For this, it's good to play a chunk of your song. So I'm going to go over here and hit play and hit start.
Let's leave our yesterdays and not leave this to waste. These days are our golden hours.
So this is helpful for determining how loud your master actually is. And so look at what you're delivering to and figure out what you need to deliver right here. Streaming services like Spotify sometimes have a different range needed than other sources. So just look up where you're delivering to and find the best. I don't want to tell you what you need here, but I'm showing you how to access it. So if you want it louder, you just come over here to your gain and push it more.
Let's leave our yesterdays.
So if you're trying to get some loudness wars going on here, you could really increase this, adjust your release so it sounds natural. And then I was able to get it to -0.8. I don't really like mastering that loud. It kind of kills some of the dynamics for me personally, but you do you. This is how you figure it out. From there, you're just about done. I usually like to listen through my whole song a couple of times and make sure I like how everything's hitting. And one tip I like to do is try not to touch my volume knob the entire time the song's going on. So listen kind of where you'd listen to music and then see if you can go the whole song without changing it. If there's things jumping out or hurting your ears, you probably should go back and address those, whether it's frequencies or certain sections, or you need more or less compression, and figuring that out for yourself. But this is a great mastering chain in my opinion, and I hope it's helpful to you and helps you start mastering your own music. That wraps up my video on mastering with stock plugins in Logic Pro. If this was helpful to you, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Also, if you have any questions or things that could use some clarification, you can put those in the comments too. If you'd like to see more content like this, you can subscribe to the channel and you'll be notified when I release new videos. Thanks again for watching and have a great rest of your day.